even when he was still alive, he was as renowned as Caesar and Charlemagne, as steeped in legend as King Arthur. He made world history as the arch-enemy of the Sultan Saladin in the Holy Land. Richard the Lionhearted, King of England. The story of Robin Hood made him a legend. He spends most of his life on the battlefield, a master of tactics and deception. His life is one long and bitter war. Apparently faced with even the most hopeless situations, he manages to triumph against a superior enemy. As a crusader, this earns him immortal fame. Richard the Lionhearted, king, knight, adventurer. For 30 years, Richard has been waging an arduous war in France. In a battle against rebels, he besieges Chalus Castle. The war is of no great importance, but it is one waged against his longtime rival, King Philip of France. When Richard goes unarmed to reconnoiter the situation before the battle, a shot from a crossbow wounds him in the shoulder. In the camp, he receives makeshift treatment for the wound. The projectile is removed in a painful operation. The wound is deep but not fatal. He has suffered many wounds in his decades of fighting. As a knight, he was typical of his age. As a warrior, he was timeless. But this time, a nameless foe has struck down Europe's greatest ruler in the course of an insignificant skirmish. From the devil we came, and to the devil we must return, he is said to have declared, before sinking into delirium. As young boys, Richard and his brothers are trained in the arts of war. For a good horseman, the safest place is in the saddle, or else in one of the many fortresses offering protection throughout the countryside. But Richard spends very few of his childhood years in England, where he was born in Oxford in 1157. His parents, Henry and Eleanor, possess territories which include all of England and large parts of France. This is where he will spend most of his life. Richard has 3 brothers. The eldest, Henry, is heir to the throne. Richard's father, King Henry, is the most powerful man in Europe, but his territory is disputed. Rebel movements rise up time and again. Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, prefers Richard to her other sons. She chooses him to be her heir. In Poitiers, Eleanor's residence, Richard spends the most carefree days of his youth. Here he gets to know the fine arts of the French troubadours. Eleanor, who was first married to King Louis VII of France, is heiress to the rich duchy of Aquitaine. Poitiers is one of Europe's main centres for courtly culture and lyric poetry. Eleanor is remarkably emancipated for a woman of her time. Richard speaks French and Latin. English is reserved for the lower classes. He writes poetry and composes songs in the style of his time, in the language of his Aquitanian home, Provençal. Richard is both wild and cultivated. He's said to have been a gifted poet and singer as well. Only 2 of his songs have been preserved, one of them together with the tune. Eleanor is a celebrated patroness of lyric poetry and a much courted lady. Her court at Poitiers is known for its wild celebrations. Many troubadours sing the praises of this noble woman. Her world is the antithesis of war. Especially in her home region of Aquitaine, Eleanor is a great promoter of the arts. She gathers singers, artists, players, and entertainers around her. Poitiers is the source of the most famous love songs of medieval France. Richard eagerly takes part in the wild celebrations. In 1172, he's named Duke of Aquitaine. England has none of the grace and joie de vivre of Poitiers in southern France. Henry is incessantly occupied with expanding his empire. He's known as a great king thanks to his administrative achievements. He's an educated man, but the ways of chivalry are foreign to him. He has a violent temper and is unpredictable. He uses everything in his power to advance his interests. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury, once his chancellor, flees from him. When he returns to England, Henry has him hunted down. Thomas Becket will meet a bloody death, murdered in his own church. He's declared a martyr by the people and the church, and is even canonized. To escape the wrath of the people and the threat of excommunication, the King of England allows himself to be scourged in public. In an attempt to consolidate his own power, Henry purposely sows discord amongst his own sons. He's a politician, even as a father, and ends up bringing the ever-feared betrayal upon himself. His 3 adolescent sons, Henry, Richard and Godfrey, are sent by Eleanor to wage war against their father. They take the side of their feudal lord, King Louis of France, Eleanor's first husband. It's a time of contradictions. Light and dark stand side by side. Henry counters the attack mercilessly and has his wife Eleanor taken prisoner. She remains in Henry's captivity until his death. The family feud escalates. For the first time, Richard's livelihood is threatened. Henry wants to remove Richard as heir to the Duchy of Aquitaine and give it to his eldest son. A merciless war is fought. During these years, the other brothers and their father unite against Richard. On their side is a man who will become Richard's arch-enemy, King Philip of France. It's largely a war between mercenaries, always fought along the same principles. First, the countryside is laid to waste. The intention is to weaken the enemy economically. Fields, forests, orchards and vineyards are devastated. The main victims in such wars are the country folk. Open field battles are rare in these times. Knights and horses are too precious. Only exhibition fights are held. Tournaments between individuals don't appear until later. Although it's forbidden, on pain of severe punishment, to strike the enemy with a keen blade, the clashes often escalate in the heat of the battle. 2 years after Richard's brother Henry, the heir apparent, meets his death, his younger brother Godfrey is killed in a tournament. The way seems clear for Richard's ascent to power. But his father will only permit him to become heir if he marries King Philip's sister, Alice. She's heiress to Gisors. Built on a hill, this fortress lies in the border region of his empire. But Richard refuses. A war breaks out, involving Richard, Henry and Philip. When Richard's father ultimately refuses to name him heir, Richard forces the King of France into a tactical alliance with him. For decades, Henry and the French king have been feuding over territorial possessions on the continent. In the dispute with his father, Richard pays tribute to the French king on behalf of Normandy, Aquitaine and Anjou, and swears loyalty against all foes. This represents high treason and the ultimate declaration of war against his father. Richard is 30 years old. With his ally Philip, he starts a war against his own father. Henry is critically ill at this point, but he has bluffed once too often. Richard is determined to see this through to the end. In Le Mans, his birthplace and favorite city, Henry seeks refuge and ends up causing a disastrous fire. When he flees from the burning city, his son follows him and almost takes him captive. With an ever-shrinking entourage, Henry wanders through the countryside, hunted by his enemies. In Chinon, on the Loire River, he takes refuge and prepares to meet his end. Almost everybody has abandoned him. His son John, supposedly his favorite, has already joined the enemy camp. But the old king is forced to leave his sanctuary once again to execute his unconditional surrender. Cursing himself and his sons, he returns to Chinon, where he will die unreconciled on July 6, 1189. When Richard approaches his father's bier in the abbey church of Fontevraud, blood runs from his nose. In those times, this was seen as a clear sign that the dead man is accusing his own son of his murder. Richard is guilty of treachery, patricide, and regicide. An historian reported that the old king's last words were, "May God spare me death until I have exacted my revenge upon you."
Es waren Zustände wie in einer griechischen Tragödie.
It was like a Greek tragedy. Everybody was fighting everybody else. Especially tragic was Richard's relationship with his father. With his character and ability, he would have provided a perfect support for the old king. But Henry II made it impossible for him to be a loyal son. In the end, he even questioned his birthright as heir to the English throne. So he felt compelled to enter into a pact with the King of England's hereditary enemy, King Philip of France. From this practical alliance, the two men developed into lifelong enemies.
On September the 3rd, 1189, Richard the Lionhearted is crowned king in Westminster Abbey. He shows his noblest side and surrounds himself with the men who served his father faithfully until the end. In a grand ceremony, worldly and religious princes ceremoniously hand over the insignia of his power. Richard provides a clear indication of how he regards himself as a ruler. He takes the crown himself and hands it to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who then places it on his head. Richard is now King of England. His realm extends from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Yet his claim to power is not questioned at home, but rather in France and the Holy Land. Richard has an ambitious goal: to reclaim the Holy Land in the name of Europe's Christendom. He has all the silver amassed by his father counted and placed in safekeeping. To add to his royal treasure, he awards positions, privileges, and titles. This enables him to collect an enormous amount of money in a short period of time. "I would even put London up for sale if I could find a buyer," he's said to have claimed. But in reality, he ensures that capable people manage the land and that the king's property is not squandered. Vézelay, in the heart of France. Here, time appears to have stood still since the days of Richard. This is where Eleanor set out with her first husband, Louis, on the Second Crusade. This is where two of Europe's most powerful sovereigns meet in the summer of 1190. The two have become bitter enemies, Richard the Lionhearted and King Philip of France, known as Philip Augustus. Philip wants to take advantage of Richard's absence to take all of France for himself. To prevent just that, Richard wants to leave the land only in Philip's company. Vézelay is where they meet to begin their journey. Undertaking a crusade to Christianity's Holy Land. This is one of the most spectacular aims of the age. The ultimate goal of every knight is to liberate the grave of Jesus and drive the Muslims from Jerusalem. Here in Vézelay, the renowned Cistercian abbot Bernard of Clairvaux rallied support for the Second Crusade. He offered soldiers and monks an astonishing deal. "Mighty soldiers, finally you have a goal for which you can fight. If you are shrewd businessmen, I can offer you a favorable deal. Take up the cross, and you will immediately receive indulgence for all your sins." "Give us crosses," the masses are said to have cried. Hundreds of thousands, monks, knights, peasants, followed this call. To penitent soldiers, it was said that a crusade pleased God more than any pilgrimage. And a contemporary historian wrote, "What more could a king ask for than to save himself from the fires of hell through great feats of arms?" These are certainly the thoughts in the minds of many of those who gather for the Third Crusade at Vézelay, not far from the rich Cistercian monastery Fontenay. But for Richard and Philip, it's also a question of winning recognition from the powerful church. The King of England is also a generous supporter of the Cistercian order, certainly not for purely selfless reasons, for the church's political influence is great. Neither Richard nor Philip is a religious fanatic. From Vézelay, the royal armies take separate paths, Richard via Marseille and Philip via Italy. They will meet again in Messina. Sicily is a rich, fertile land. This is where the mighty Norman treasure is kept. Richard's need for funds is immense. And frankly, Richard is in Sicily for the money. Tancred, the new ruler of the island, took the widow of the Norman king captive following her husband's death. This woman, Joan, is Richard's sister. Monreale was founded by her husband. The splendor and wealth of the Norman culture can still be admired here today. At the time, no other kingdom in the Occident possessed such cultural variety as this one. Richard kills two birds with one stone. He frees his sister Joan and seizes a large part of the Norman riches, 60 tons of silver, to finance his crusade to the Holy Land. A brilliant move. In a surprise attack, he occupies Messina. After only 5 hours, Richard's banner flies over the city. He and his men set up camp outside the city, while Philip occupies a palace in the city. Despite being threatened with draconian punishment, the Crusaders pass the next few months engaged in exhibition fights and gambling. This sows much discord, especially when it comes to debts. Gambling is strictly forbidden for the simple soldiers. Anyone who is caught is stripped naked and whipped for 3 days. Knights and clergymen, however, are allowed to gamble, but their stakes are limited. Of course, kings can gamble as much as they please. Richard is forced to remain a full 6 months on Sicily because winter storms prevent further progress, and he has another problem. He's still engaged to the sister of French King Philip. Unknown to Philip, Richard is awaiting Berengaria of Navarra. She's the one he wants to marry. It's a time of superstition. Many bad omens precede Richard on his way to the Holy Land. Events in nature, such as volcanic eruptions and celestial phenomena, are used by medieval people to predict the future. Richard seeks counsel with the renowned monk and prophet Joachim of Fiore. He predicts that Saladin will be driven out of the kingdom of Jerusalem. And, he said, God has resolved that all these things shall be done by you. In spring 1191, the English fleet, with more than 200 ships, an impressive number not just in those days, finally set sail for Palestine. The voyage is plagued by calm spells and fierce hurricanes. Near Cyprus, the English fleet encounters a heavy storm and many ships capsize. Richard's sister Joan is among the shipwrecked. Isaac Komnenos, the island's ruler, refuses to release the captives. For Richard, this is a welcome challenge, which justifies his second military intervention, the capture of Cyprus. What appears to be a coincidence has probably been planned long in advance. Cyprus, with its strategic location and its wealth of food, is perfect as a backup and supply base on the way to the Holy Land. Richard, as a military strategist, is well aware of this. He simply kept his intentions a secret. The capture of Cyprus is no adventure. It's a carefully calculated undertaking by land and by sea. Isaac puts up a brave fight, but he's no match for Europe's elite troops. Still, he does not surrender. He retreats to the impregnable fortress of Kantara. The island of Cyprus, with its mighty castles, is hard to capture. Perched like eyries high in the mountains, the castles are almost impossible to conquer. Isaac believes that he and his followers can seek shelter there and wait until the King of England moves on to the Holy Land. But Isaac has figured wrong. Richard himself fights at the front against the Greek foe. He leads his army north to take a series of fortresses. The harbour town of Kyrenia also capitulates under the Crusaders' advances. Isaac's daughter, who had taken refuge in the citadel, falls into enemy hands. When Isaac hears that she's been taken prisoner, he surrenders and pleads with the enemy not to place him in irons. Richard agrees and has chains made out of silver for him. In this way, he can keep his word and break it at the same time, a symbolic deed which adds a new shine to the reputation he has amongst his opponents. In Limassol, Richard finally marries Berengaria, a princess of Navarra. This seals his breakup with Philip's sister Alice. To Philip, this new bride is a reason to declare war on Richard. But Richard knows, as long as Philip's hands are tied in the Holy Land, he can't dispute Richard's possessions in France.
In Zypern ist Richard der unangefochtene Sieger.
On Cyprus, Richard is the undisputed winner. But this is only half the story. The other half is that he has been caught in a web of intrigue spun against him by the French king. The fact that Richard married Berengaria and rejected Philip's sister is used as a pretext to declare a global smear campaign against him. In reality, Philip would like to overthrow Richard and prepare the way for the end of his reign. In the Holy Land, this conflict will ultimately escalate.
There's jubilation in the camp near Akko. Richard, the richest and most powerful king in Christendom, has finally arrived. His reputation for victory has preceded him. Not only that, he also sank one of Saladin's supply ships on his way there. His fleet seals off the richest seaport in Palestine, and the city is cut off from further supplies. When he arrived, the Muslims lost all heart, according to Arab sources. 2 years before Richard's coronation, the mighty Sultan Saladin, ruler of a gigantic empire, conquered Jerusalem. The Christian kingdom was thus eradicated. It had been established 90 years earlier by the Knights of the First Crusade, following bloody massacres in Palestine. Saladin and his Muslim troops also stormed a number of the supposedly unconquerable castles of the Crusaders. These mighty fortresses had been established in the Holy Land by the Christian orders of knighthood after the First Crusade. For years, battles were fought over individual fortresses. This made Saladin's military achievements all the more shocking. A terrible reputation preceded him. Oni-Belvoir Castle, one of the most imposing fortresses in the Holy Land, was able to withstand the onslaught for several months. In 1187, on the hills of Hattin, the descendants of the First Crusaders fought their final battle in the scorching heat. It was a devastating defeat. The survivors, the Templars and the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, the elite Christian knights, were mercilessly beheaded in revenge for the massacre of the First Crusade. However, Saladin, who is said to be a mild and just ruler, spares the Christian civilian population in Palestine. Barely 100 years after the warriors of the First Crusade founded the Kingdom of Jerusalem, it's firmly back in Muslim hands. Jerusalem is the symbolic capital of Christendom, but also of the Muslim world. This was the place of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, and from here Muhammad ascended to heaven on his horse Baruch. Both Christians and Muslims claim Jerusalem as their holy city. Akko is the richest and most powerful seaport in Palestine. When Richard the Lionhearted arrives on the scene, the city has been in Saladin's possession for 2 years. Surrounded by a mighty wall, it's practically impenetrable from the sea. Akko is of great strategic importance as a base in the Holy Land. The Muslims receive food supplies from the sea through subterranean tunnels, but spies can also penetrate the city in this way. The enemy camp has a cleverly devised espionage system. Particularly under the cover of night, enemy spies probe the Muslims' weaknesses. Using all means available, the siege is begun. But despite constant fighting, which devastates the land around the harbour city, neither side is able to gain the upper hand. With great foresight, Richard has brought a long siege train. Catapults sling stones, refuse and corpses into the citadel, an early form of biological warfare. Time and again, troops attack the mighty fortifications. Shielded battering rams are intended to break holes in the walls. Such devices are used by the Crusaders in an attempt to shake the Muslims' morale. Richard has been in the Holy Land for less than 4 weeks, and already the city is ready to be stormed. Acre falls into the Crusaders' hands. Thousands of people are taken hostage. Who really has the command over this besieging army? Before Richard arrived, the undisputed leader was Philip. He wanted to keep the political leadership for himself and leave Richard to fight the battles and pay the bills. Philip had already set the stage for this distribution of roles before Richard's arrival. He had promised his loyal supporter, Conrad of Montferrat, the crown to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Richard will not stand for that. It's time to confront his rival. After Akko is taken, the Duke of Austria also raises his flag over the fortress, which should guarantee him a share of the booty. But since he is in Philip's political camp, Richard loses control of himself and has the flag thrown into the moat, a deed which has been recorded by many historians. He has no idea what fatal consequences this act will have for him following his return to Europe. To Philip and Richard's other enemies, this is another example of the English king's hot-headed arrogance towards others. In the midst of this heated debate, Philip suddenly leaves. He's said to be ill, but in reality he's got better things to do than wage war in a foreign land for foreign purposes. He wants to take advantage of Richard's absence to go to war in France. Richard is forced to continue the crusade against Saladin in the Holy Land all by himself.
Es ist die besondere Tragik in Richards Leben.
It is the greatest tragedy in Richard's life that many of his efforts are tied up in defense. Richard, who has gone down in history as a great warrior, is more than anything a realistic politician, tactician, and diplomat. On his departure, King Philip gave instructions to continue the policy of obstruction against the King of England. So Richard not only had to fight Saladin, but also Conrad of Montferrat, who was in Philip's camp as heir to the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
On his own initiative, Conrad of Montferrat conducts negotiations with Saladin, pursuing a separate peace with considerable losses. He offers the Sultan half of the hostages from Akko as security. When Saladin draws out negotiations on the hostages to gain time, their fate is sealed. Richard has the 2,600 hostages brutally murdered within view of the enemy camp, not on an impulse, not out of religious fanaticism, but out of cold-blooded calculation. The march on Jerusalem is fraught with great dangers. Most of the Crusaders' bastions on the coast and in the interior are no longer in Christian hands. But the conquest of Akko meant the fall of one of Saladin's main bastions. 2 days after the massacre, Richard sets out for the south. He's heading for Jaffa. For most Crusaders, the ultimate goal is Jerusalem, but to go through the interior would be fatal. It's an intentionally slow march which takes into account the heat, the impassable terrain, and the enemy. Each step represents the uncontested capture of another slice of the coast. Caesarea and Haifa are abandoned by Saladin and subsequently destroyed. Everywhere they go, the Crusaders find that Saladin's men have been there first and have razed the Christian cities and castles to the ground. Saladin doesn't have enough men to defend the fortresses, but he doesn't want to leave any fortifications intact for the Crusaders. Only the presence of the fleet makes it possible for Richard to supply his men. What follows is a masterly achievement of medieval tactical warfare. Under the burning sun, Richard keeps his men together, ruling with an iron hand. Time and again, the lightly armoured Saracens try to break through the ranks. Richard's strongest weapon are his foot soldiers. In close formation, they march mile after mile. The strength of the mounted archers is their great agility. Richard's strength are his heavily armed and well-armoured knights, but his strength is also his weakness. In the unbearable heat, his men drop like flies, perishing from heat stroke. A knight is expensive and irreplaceable. But Saladin enjoys a legendary reputation in the Islamic world as the liberator of Jerusalem. With his holy war against the Christians, the Jihad, he has managed to unite a fractured Muslim world. Still, the King of England has made Saladin suffer his first major defeat and is now marching on Jerusalem. This has caused Saladin to lose prestige. He must act. He must attempt an open field battle. He's realized that the Crusaders' army cannot be drawn out of its reserve through provocations. He chooses the terrain for the battle carefully, the plains of Arsuf. Richard has no choice. He takes the offensive with his knights and leads a series of attacks on the main front, which ultimately results in victory. But despite having won the battle, the war is far from over. Jerusalem hasn't been taken yet. And how can Richard take Jerusalem and keep it? In the Crusaders' camp, apprehension starts to spread. The army, the Crusaders, want to storm the holy city once and for all. But Richard considers attacking Saladin and bringing him to his knees in his center of power, Egypt. For 3 days, he doesn't leave his tent. The King of England is well aware that it's impossible to besiege Jerusalem. On the one hand, the supply routes to the coast must be kept open, and on the other, Saladin's army must be held in check. This is beyond the capacity of the Crusaders' army. But how can he tell his army? Richard can just imagine the disastrous result. This daredevil lone warrior is also a cautious strategist and senses a conspiracy. If he remains in Jerusalem, Philip will win the war against him in France. But these arguments don't hold any water for the Crusaders. To maintain control over his army, Richard decides to head for Jerusalem. Once again, Conrad of Montferrat crosses the King of England. He decides to conclude another secret agreement with Saladin. Surprisingly, Richard does an about-face. He apparently acknowledges the ruler of the Crusader city, Tyre, as the future king of Jerusalem. This ruins Saladin's policy of coming between the two Crusaders. But then Conrad is suddenly murdered in Tyre. The murderers belong to the sect of fanatics known as the Assassins. Did Saladin order them to assassinate first Conrad and then Richard? Or was Richard the one who gave the order to kill Conrad? According to one Arabic source, Saladin is guilty, but one of the murderers claims that Richard was behind it all. Richard is the one who profits most from Conrad's death. Once again, Richard has achieved the impossible. he decides to make his nephew, Henry of Champagne, king of Jerusalem. Thus strengthened, he will continue the war against Saladin alone. During the march to Jaffa via Arsuf, the fleet sails along the coast and supplies the troops on land. For a second time, Richard attempts the march on Jerusalem. Saladin has holed up there. In the early summer of 1192, Richard's army sets up camp only a few miles outside the walls of the Holy City. He's back where he was 6 months earlier. Only once Richard sets eyes on the long sought-after city, and his fears are confirmed that storming the city would require a great number of supply troops and equipment. Besides, Jerusalem is of no strategic or economic significance. Even if he were to succeed in storming the walls, this victory would be the end of him. In the heat of victory, the army would dissipate, and after the Crusaders left, Saladin would take control over the city again. Once again, Richard decides against besieging the city. He wants to strike Saladin where he's most vulnerable. Richard's goal is Cairo. He's prepared to send 700 knights and 2,000 soldiers there at his own expense. The wealth of the land on the Nile finances Saladin's wars in the Holy Land. Egypt's wealth is used by the Sultan not only to acquire soldiers, but also to build mosques. Years later, the maxim, "the keys to Jerusalem are to be found in Cairo," will represent the principle upon which the Crusaders' strategy is founded. But Saladin is faster, and he arms himself for a military counteroffensive. It's an extremely daring undertaking, which recalls the deeds of the greatest generals in history. In a blitzkrieg assault, the Sultan conquers Jaffa, a key bastion, which Richard then wins back in a spectacular campaign. Countless sources testify to the military brilliance of this action and to Richard's audacity and tactical skills. After Jaffa, both sides want peace. Richard is at the end of his rope. Victory is practically out of the question. Seriously ill, he uses Arab middlemen to convince the war-hungry Saladin to agree to a peace treaty. The Christians are left with a narrow coastal strip between Tyre and Jaffa. Saladin permits Richard access to the Holy Sepulchre, but he turns down the offer. After 18 months, he leaves Palestine without having set foot in Jerusalem.
With so much internal opposition, it would have been impossible for Richard to secure a spectacular victory. And yet, it is thanks to Richard that the Kingdom of Jerusalem survived for another 100 years. His greatest achievement was probably that he avoided the trap Philip had prepared for him by deciding not to besiege Jerusalem. This would undoubtedly have led to a terrible military disaster.
In October 1192, the King of England boards a ship to bring him across the Mediterranean back to his home country. It's almost winter. The voyage is a difficult one. Surrounded by enemies, Richard is unable to land at Marseille. He circumnavigates Italy and decides to land near Aquileia. With an entourage of 20 men, he heads north. According to historians, he's heading for the territory of his brother-in-law, Henry the Lion. But a number of people are interested in seeing Richard taken captive, most of all King Philip of France and the German Emperor. A daring enterprise. The King of England, the most powerful man in Europe, flees with a few loyal men through the Austrian countryside. But it's impossible for such a wealthy king to travel through this area unnoticed. Richard is trailed by the Emperor's spies right from the start. With great difficulty, he manages to reach the countryside around Vienna. There he's taken captive by Duke Leopold of all people, the man whom he had humiliated in Acre. He probably wasn't recognized by his ring, as it's claimed in one legend, but rather by his royal glove, which his page had stuck in his belt. A similar glove can be found today in the Art History Museum in Vienna. It must have been a great triumph for Philip to hear of Richard's arrest. For him and the German emperor, it appeared to be a divine gift. The German emperor, Henry, immediately contacts Philip to find out what the catch is worth to the French king. Richard is brought to Dürnstein Castle, high above the Danube. He will only remain captive here for a few short weeks. Today the castle is in ruins, but it has been immortalized by the legend of the royal minstrel Blondel, who travels through all of Germany from city to city in search of his beloved lord, Richard the Lionhearted. All the while he sings a song which the two of them are said to have composed together. He finally finds him in Dürnstein. This little town still lives from this famous legend, but there's no historical proof to back up the story. The day of reckoning has arrived, and not just for Leopold. From Dürnstein, Richard the Lionhearted is brought to Speyer. Many have a score to settle with the English king, particularly Emperor Henry himself. In Speyer, the emperor charges Richard with murder. But the charges, murdering Conrad of Montferrat, high treason in the Holy Land, are dropped that same day. In reality, the German emperor wants Richard to join forces with him to conquer France. Richard cleverly manipulates the emperor's political designs for his own ends. In return for 150,000 marks in silver, the King of England is to be set free. Richard is held captive in various places: Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and the castle of Trifels. Trifels is a proper prison. Richard's primary objective is to prevent an alliance between his two enemies, Philip and the German emperor. With the help of messengers, he's able to conduct a skillful diplomacy during his imprisonment. After 14 months in prison, he's finally freed. A portion of the ransom has been paid, and hostages are provided as security for the rest.
Wieder sieht sich Richard zwischen zwei mächtige Feinde gestellt.
Once again, Richard finds himself between two powerful enemies. This time, it is Emperor Henry VI and King Philip of France. Once again, he is able to use diplomacy and double dealing to play the two against each other. The emperor forces him to recognize his sovereignty, but in the end, it's not the German emperor who interferes in English affairs, but rather the English king who determines the empire's policies.
Sondern der englische König, der Reichspolitik macht.
Richard has no time to lose, because while he was away, his own brother, John, has made a deal with Philip behind his back, agreeing to cede some of England's possessions in France. Philip has also extended his policy of conquering central France. It's an explosive situation. Richard returns to England to put a stop to his treacherous brother John's activities. But by the time he arrives home, John's rebellion has already collapsed. The most famous stories surrounding Richard tell of his legendary evil brother John Lackland and the man who opposed him, Robin Hood.
Wo ist der König? Das weiß ich nicht. Männer, wir müssen König Richard finden. Er muss in Sicherheit gebracht werden. John, du nimmst ein paar Männer und suchst die Straßen ab. Bruder Dick, in die Stadt. Will, durchsucht jeden Winkel. Ihr dürft nicht ruhen, Tag und Nacht, bis ihr ihn gefunden habt.
Sucht nicht nach eurem König Robin. Er ist in guten Händen, in den besten.
Sagt mir, wo er ist.
Hier.
Majestät.
Ihr alle seid mir treu geblieben. Steht auf, Robin. Steht auf, Männer von Sherwood!
Majestät, morgen wird der Bischof von Black Cannons Prinz John in Nottingham zum König krönen.
But the legend of Robin Hood originated in a later era. If Robin Hood ever did walk in Sherwood Forest, then it was only afterwards that it was set in the time of Richard. Yet it's an endearing romantic legend, and partly responsible for ensuring that King Richard the Lionhearted remains in the hearts and minds of people to this day.
The real Richard the Lionhearted had little to do with the adventurer in the legends, and yet the myth is founded in reality, if only in a more profound sense. As a lone warrior surrounded by enemies, he embodies the archetype of the fearless knight who never gives up, even in the most hopeless situations.
In Canterbury Cathedral, Richard gives thanks to the God who saved him from death throughout the turmoil. Shortly after Easter 1194, he appears with all the insignia of his power before all the princes of his kingdom in Winchester Abbey. Then he goes back to war. He has Chateau Gaillard built on the Seine to protect Normandy from Philip. It's an expensive, impenetrable fortress, the prototype of the gigantic modern fortification. It's meant to bring to a close the seemingly endless conflicts with Philip. But Richard also tries to surround Philip using political means. After the death of Emperor Henry VI, he does all he can to have his nephew Otto declared the German king. Richard pays the electorate. He conducts family and world policy. Richard's 3 lions and half the imperial eagle thus become the coat of arms of the German king, and have since adorned the emperor's sword in the treasure chamber of the Art History Museum in Vienna. Like Richard, Otto is described as a chivalrous and daring man. 10 years later, he reaches the zenith of his power as the German Emperor Otto IV. The old conflict between England and France continues, but Richard is increasingly victorious against Philip. For more than 25 years, he's been waging a grueling war using all available means, and although he hasn't achieved any spectacular victories, he's the most feared ruler in Europe. He has villages and castles ruthlessly burned to the ground. Rebels end up on the gallows. Chalut was not a particularly difficult fortress to take. It was of only minor significance. This is why nobody expected the King of England to be at the battle. Richard demands unconditional surrender. The beleaguered troops refuse. The king swears to have them all hanged once he takes the fortress. Suddenly, Richard is struck by a bolt from a crossbow. The archer, Peter Basil, had nothing to lose. It's said that Richard forgave him afterwards, but that too belongs to the realm of legend. The archer is flayed and skinned. Richard's wound was not fatal, but the gangrene could not be stopped. On April the 6th, 1199, Richard I of England receives the last rites. Like his father, he is interred in the abbey at Fontevraud. In his will, he declares his wish to be buried at his father's feet. This can be seen as a sign of Richard's remorse for his father's death. He remains there to this day, with his father Henry and his mother Eleanor, who died 5 years later. The death mask, which dates from Richard's time and can be taken to represent his actual appearance, portrays him as a brave and determined man. His heart, the lion's heart, is placed in a lead coffer and brought to the cathedral in Rouen. Out of gratitude for the town's constant loyalty, but also to provide symbolic support, because the capital of Normandy will soon fall. This much is certain. After decades of fighting, Richard the Lionhearted left the stage of world politics as a tragic loser. He reigned over a kingdom which fell apart shortly after his death. He left no heir, And yet an Arab historian still declared Richard's bravery, acumen, energy and patience made him one of the most remarkable rulers of his time.